Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government. We're at Harvard, and we're taking up one of Harvard's greatest professors, Michael Sandel, taking up his book, which is called The Tyranny of Merit. There's a panel of two others who will ask him questions, and then we'll go to the audience for Q&A. Okay. We're beginning with Sarah Gustafson, who is a graduate student at Harvard. She's a graduate of Davidson College, and she'll is writing her dissertation on Tocqueville and charity. Then we'll go to Christopher Caldwell, who is a journalist, graduate of Harvard, has written a book on reflections on the revolution in Europe and the latest, The Age of Entitlement. He now has recently become an opinion editor at the, or contributor at the New York Times, and he writes for other more conservative publications like the Claremont Review of Books. And then Michael Sandel, and we're discussing his book called The Tyranny of Merit. He's also written the Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, and a book on justice, which is based on his famous course at Harvard under that name. Thousands of Harvard students know him well. He is by far the most famous of the political theory people at Harvard, although we're proud of him and delighted to be able to honor him today. His book, The Tyranny of Merit, not meritocracy, but merit, is a very fine book. I especially recommend chapter 5 on success ethics, which took my heart and impressed me no end. But we'll be discussing this book and hearing what he has to say in explanation and defense of it. I should add at the end that he's a graduate of Brandeis and of Oxford, and he is the Bass Professor of Government at Harvard. So let's begin then with Sarah Gustafson.
Let me just say, it's such a privilege to be a part of this conversation. I feel very, very much the junior member of this panel and this conversation, but what a privilege. I have both Professor Mansfield and Professor Sandel on my dissertation committee, and so this feels right and lovely and an honor in a number of ways. I had the privilege last semester of teaching for Professor Sandel, and he was kind enough to give all of his TFs a copy of this book. So it was great to have this opportunity to revisit it, as I also read it back in the fall when I was teaching for him. So there's so many things that I could say that maybe are better postponed for later in the conversation. But I'm going to ask a question very much in light of my state in life, which is as a graduate student of political philosophy and as a teacher. One thing that struck me in revisiting the book is the way in which the language of merit and desert can align an idea of merit with ideas of excellence or virtue. And these things are obviously very, very closely connected, but they seem also in some way to be distinguishable. Frank Knight, as you share in the book, Professor Sandel, was keen to make a distinction between a market value and the ethical or the moral good of something. And I wonder if we can make a similar distinction between merit according to a meritocratic system and what is good simply or excellent simply. And I wonder if this is part of the problem that exacerbated by the way our high schools and universities have been structured, especially since James Conant. We tend to align these things that are actually in some way distinct, and that as a result, the university has increasingly been seen as a means of social mobility and opportunity. And this is somewhat in contrast with the broad equality of conditions that you call for at the end of the book, and that Christopher Lasch, as you cited, identified as in the 19th century being a characteristic of America, where enlightenment was not determined necessarily by a university education or a credential. In my own conversations with students at Harvard, but also at other institutions, Not all of them, but many of them see higher education as a training ground for future leaders and as a means of social change, and not fundamentally as an institution of learning. And they're very enthusiastic about this as it coincides with their concern for social change. This is coupled, I've often found, and I wonder if you've found the same, with a cultural fear of missing out that seems born of not wanting to miss any advantage, particularly for social networking, that someone could accrue instead of you. Professor Mansfield mentioned my alma mater, Davidson. I notice I'm wearing my alma mater's colors right now, not quite on purpose. But my alma mater had a strong tradition of encouraging study abroad as a way to escape, I think, a trap of meritocratic thinking. And in retrospect, I'm quite fond of that. And it's interesting to me that many Harvard students, many Ivy League students don't study abroad, I think in part of this fear of missing out. And so these attitudes seem to subordinate or forget another purpose of both the high school and the university, which is to provide an education and help students develop excellences and pursue excellences of mastery of material. Zena Hitz, in her recent book, Lost in Thought, made the point that learning for its own sake that formed a part of the Anglophone intellectual culture in the 20th century, which shaped and expressed its egalitarian ideals, has gradually been traded for learning for social utility, for the sake of making a difference, and that this has contributed to a decay of our intellectual institutions. So I wonder if, as much as the esteem of non-college educated persons in America is waning, perhaps the esteem and sense of freedom of college students is also under attack by an instrumentalization of higher education, by the striving that you identify that can come at the risk at the expense of rest or contemplation. And so, in your book, one of the corrections to meritocratic hubris are taxes and policies that would emphasize the dignity of work rather than the mobility of education. And I think that's excellent. But I wonder too whether part of correcting meritocratic hubris and credentialism would have to do with a correction away from the instrumentalization of college and its subordination to social goals, while also making clear a distinction between moral and intellectual excellences and the merit that is regarded as meritorious by our systems of meritocracy. So my question is this, as two-part. How might we, both for the non-college educated and the college educated, emphasize the intrinsic value of education rather than its social mobility or its social functions? And two, how do we not throw the baby excellence, certain ideas of human virtues, out with the bathwater that is meritocracy?
Thank you, Sarah. That's fine. So I think we'll just go directly to Chris Caldwell if Michael is alive enough to remember Sarah's question. Okay, very good. Chris,
I was under the impression that I was going to ask a couple of questions as the afternoon went on, but I can bundle my thoughts into one talk like Sarah's, if you would prefer that.
No, let's do it with a series of questions, if that's what you
Okay. Then I'll just leave Professor Sandel, to whom greetings, to answer Sarah's question then.
Okay. Well, first, thank you to Harvey for convening us, and I feel privileged to have Sarah and Christopher Caldwell as discussants for this seminar. I'm grateful to you both. Sarah, I know and admire from having seen her teaching, as she mentioned, last semester in my course. And Christopher, I've admired your writings for a long time, so it's good to be able to meet you even at a distance.
Thank you.
Sarah raises two questions that really go right to the heart of the book, and not surprisingly perhaps, but they're hugely important questions. And my short answer is yes, you've got it exactly right. First, on higher education and the purpose of education. Central to the argument of the book is the idea that in the meritocracy that we have and live, we have converted higher education into being an arbiter of opportunity for a meritocratic society. Universities are the institutions that confer the credentials and define the merits that a market-driven meritocratic society honors and rewards. This has enlarged the social and political and cultural importance of universities, and yet it's come at a great moral cost. And Sarah has identified exactly the cost to which I want to draw attention, and that is that by assigning colleges and universities as the arbiters of opportunity, sitting astride the system of meritocracy, we have damaged them by allowing the, just as Sarah says, the instrumental value of education, equipping people to compete for meritocratic success and for individual upward mobility. We've allowed the instrumental networking, credentializing, sorting function of the university to crowd out, to eclipse the intrinsic value of education. Sarah has it exactly right. Networking, sorting, and credentializing have crowded out teaching and learning as the intrinsic goods for which universities should exist. And I call the chapter of the book on higher education the sorting machine, because I think this is at the heart of the problem. And I see it in, well, let me back up. The appeal of the meritocratic idea, and especially of higher education, is that no longer would students win admission to selective colleges and universities based on the accident of birth, their parents' privilege, but instead they could earn it on their own by striving, by doing well in school, by doing well on standardized tests, by proving their merits. But privileged parents have figured out how to convey their advantages to their kids, not by leaving them large estates, but by giving them all of the educational advantages that equip them to do well on the standardized tests and the other measures of merit that make them competitive candidates for admission to universities, from SAT prep courses to enrichment activities to internships, good works in distant places, all to assemble a resume and an application profile, the better to win admission to selective colleges and universities. And so, but this exacts a price, a heavy price, even on the winners. The tyranny of merit oppresses not only those who are left behind, who can't compete in this system, it also oppresses the winners, because it converts the adolescent years into a stress-strewn meritocratic gauntlet of high-pressure achievement that instrumentalizes learning. And by the time many students survive this meritocratic gauntlet, the winners, they are so in the habit of hoop jumping and networking and seeking the next credential that they have little time and repose. I like that Sarah emphasized the word repose, to reflect about what's worth caring about and why. And that repose and that reflection should be right at the heart of college or university education. So yes, that seems to me one of the way in which higher education has been disfigured by being cast in this role is one of the defects of the meritocracy I worry about. Sarah raises another trenchant point about the distinction between merit as defined in terms of market value and merit understood as excellence or virtue or a moral good. And this too is a central theme of the book. And in chapter 5, which Harvey mentioned on success ethics, I try to show how this idea of merit as market value came to predominate, so that today we often assume that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. But this is a mistake. The money people make is based largely on how well or adeptly they manage to cater to the consumer preferences that constitute the market for goods and services. But there's no reason to believe that being adept at catering to the de facto preferences that happen to exist constitutes a genuine contribution to the common good or to a good society. So part of the argument, and this is admittedly quite thoroughgoing, is that we make a mistake to outsource our judgments, our moral judgments about what counts as a truly valuable contribution to the common good, to markets. Instead, we need to reclaim that judgment as democratic citizens and reason together, argue together. We will disagree, but argue together about what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. Now, if we had, and this is the ultimate test of, or maybe the implicit challenge of the distinction Sarah has drawn, if we somehow allocated rewards and honor and esteem and recognition on the basis of contributions to the common good, merit, virtue, excellence, merit in that sense, then we would not be afflicted with the tyranny of merit I describe, but partly because we wouldn't be reliant on merit as market value, and partly because that scheme of recognition would not generate among the successful the meritocratic hubris, the sense that we are self-made and self-sufficient that attaches to our current understanding of merit. So on both of those scores, Sarah, my short answer is yes, and thank you for articulating and highlighting beautifully the kinds of distinctions that underlie my worry about the tyranny of merit.
Thank you. So now we'll go to Chris, and you can proceed as you wish.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you all for having me. I thank Professor Sandel for writing this very impressive book. I have the experience in reading it that I've had in reading you before, which is that you tend to follow a track around a subject and keep allowing it to ramify to the point where you turn back on yourself. And at the end of the book, you've surrounded this whole subject. This seems to me a book not just about meritocracy, but about meritocracy and inequality, meritocracy and technocracy, meritocracy and corruption, meritocracy and hypocrisy, and meritocracy as an attack, as you've just been discussing with Sarah, on the kind of leisure out of which real culture is built. There's some political questions that present themselves very quickly, and you start the book with some of them, but I'd rather hold off on them, since once one brings up politics, everything tends to follow that down the chute. Maybe I could talk about a certain psychological thing that goes throughout your book, which is that you're influenced by the reading of Michael Young, now over 60 years ago, who coined the word meritocracy, and you tend to accept, I think, without questioning, his depiction of what's going to happen psychologically to the participants in a meritocracy. That those who succeed in it are going to feel that they deserve what they have, don't need to take any account of chance, and that those who fail will be somehow psychologically damaged in their self-esteem. As you put it in a very nice phrase in the middle of the book somewhere, they'll view meritocracy as less a promise than a taunt. I'm just wondering, that does seem consistent with certain evidence that we can see around us. Certainly the deaths of despair, if we link those to our meritocracy. But are you quite sure about the psychology of this? And do you not feel you might want to prove it a little more? And I say that just in the spirit of Descartes, who, as you know, started the discourse on method with the idea that good sense is of all things the best, the most, the best distributed, because everyone thinks he's got more than the average supply of this. I think that's a proposition that's true only because good sense is a form of merit. And I would expect that to be true in a meritocracy too. That is, I would expect those who fail in a meritocracy to respond not with a sense of their own worthlessness, but with a sense of the criterion's inappropriateness.
Okay, so thank you for that, Christopher. And this, I suppose you could question, and maybe you would question the psychology of meritocracy that I attribute to it, and that's in line, just as you say, with the way Michael Young conceived it when he coined the term, from both directions. I suggest, following Michael Young, I suggest basically that Michael Young was onto something, that he had glimpsed the future, that he did glimpse something important in the way a meritocratic society would unfold, including its moral and social and political psychology. And there are two dimensions to this, and you might believe that I've overestimated both. But let me ask you, one dimension is I say it generates hubris among the winners, who are inclined to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and by implication that those who struggle, those left behind, have no one to blame but themselves. This is the hubris. And then, for their part, and this was the part you just now mentioned, Christopher, those who don't flourish in the new economy, in a highly mobile meritocratic society with global competition, those who don't flourish feel they are looked down upon by elites, and to some extent at least absorb the verdict, the harsh verdict of a meritocratic society, which prizes individual responsibility, which urges individual upward mobility through higher education, such that those who aren't flourishing and who don't have a college degree, to some extent say, perhaps the system is rigged, I didn't have a fair chance, but also with another part of themselves, and this is my claim, accept the harsh verdict of the meritocracy, whose premise they largely accept. And so you might think I've overstated both, or do you think it's mainly the second, Christopher?
No, I don't even say you've overstated it.
I see.
You are writing as a philosopher. I accept it as a philosophical description of the problem. I just wonder, as a psychological matter, how this plays out. And you've identified two ways in which the damage of meritocracy might inflict itself on the losers. The one is through psychological damage. They feel that they internalize the system's sense of them. But the second is just by alienating them from the system. They recognize that others look down on them, and it's not even really necessary that they accept the verdict of those who look down on them to be damaged by it. Now, I'd like to ask you about a couple of philosophers, okay?
Before we get to the philosophers, just on the empirical question that you pressed me on rightly, one bit of evidence about the looking down, which is quite striking, is a study by some social psychologists, whom I quote in the book, who did studies of attitudes toward various disfavored groups in society. And they did this study in the US, in Britain, and in some European countries. And they gave the respondents to the survey a list of disfavored groups and minorities of various kinds, and asked whom they liked least. And of all the disfavored groups, those without a college education, the less well-educated, were the most disliked. And what's interesting, that this held up both in the US and in the Western European countries where they did the survey. And when they gave the survey to people who themselves were of lesser education, the results were the same. The results. So here, now this isn't definitive evidence by any means, but it tends to support the thought that to some degree, even those who struggle, even those who feel resentments at elites looking down, to some extent have absorbed the judgment that the system encourages them to make.
But I think this is another thing the system has done, though, is it has put certain kinds of group approval, most strikingly racism and sexism, off limits. So you have actually a limited number of groups that you're permitted to disapprove of. So it's not a totally level playing field that we're dealing with here.
Well, let me just ask you about that, because that's an interesting suggestion. But let's suppose that that's true. That still requires us to account for it. Why is it that if it's true that credentialism is the last acceptable prejudice, why is credentialism not subject to the same opprobrium as other forms of prejudice? And my argument would be, it's precisely because the meritocratic way of thinking about winning and losing, about success, and about justified inequalities, the meritocratic way has such a grip that credentialism, which is the meritocratic prejudice, is the one that seems to be most exempt from general opprobrium. And that's interesting. That's important. That's worth explaining. And if my general account is right, it would offer a kind of explanation for that, wouldn't it, Christopher?
Yes, I think it would. And again, I hate to seem to dodge your philosophical point by retreating into empiricism, but I wonder how we don't tend to get a good sampling of meritocratic loser opinion. And so I'm not sure that credentialism is an acceptable prejudice in the entirety of society. I mean, among us, it's either an acceptable prejudice, or it's a character flaw that you have to learn to accept, that certain people are going to be credentialist. I'm not sure it looks that way in parts of the country, for instance, where nobody knows anybody who has a Harvard degree. And so if they were listening to this conversation, not knowing what it is, tuning in on, Zoom or whatever, and they didn't know what the conversation was, and suddenly it said, this is a discussion by a bunch of Harvard people. I wonder if that would increase its credibility in their eyes or decrease it.
Okay, all
I
right,
don't-
fair enough. Let's hear, I'm keen to hear what you wanted to ask about the philosophers. Go ahead.
Well, okay, so you have, it's a very interesting area where you show a certain commonality between John Rawls and Friedrich von Hayek in their understanding of how merit relates to the marketplace. And you show that they don't, neither of them believes that what the market is measuring is merit, strictly speaking. And so Rawls rejects merit, but there's an interesting way that he does it, and I'll defer to you on the description of it. But as I will paraphrase your argument, it's basically using what he calls the difference principle, which is to treat the diversity of human talents as common property and try and come up with a set of rules by which that common property is distributed or divided or managed. And if at the end there's an increment left over, it can be left to whoever we decide it should be left to. Now, this actually seems to have been at the heart of, let's say, the third way argument in the 1990s. And I think a very interesting political point you make in the book is that there may be more resentment to parties of the center left that have presided over the increase in inequality than towards parties of the center right. And I think that's correct. I agree with that. And I've often wondered why that is. But I think it might be that there was a broken promise. And I'm trying to get at the nature of the promise. The promise, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you view it as a Rawlsian promise, which is, it took the form, the promise took the form of efficiency now, equity later. That is, the country was engaged in a new adventure of the global economy. And so what were we going to do? Were we going to strip these big companies bare, like these, like AOL and, whatever these big, companies were of the 1990s, or we're going to let them develop and try and redistribute that, the gains of it. What we didn't realize is that when the time to redistribute came 10 years later, actually it would be the same situation as the one we were facing when we said, well, let's wait another 10 years to figure it out last time. So the decision would keep getting displaced. And in making what we thought were provisional decisions, we were actually laying down permanent principles. So what happened? What is that a failure of? Is that a failure of Rawlsian liberalism? Or is it a failure of a few politicians in the 1990s? And whichever it is, why have we been unable to get out of it?
Right. I think it's all of the above, a failure of all of the above. But I think you frame it in a nice way. It was a broken promise of kind of 1980s, 1990s liberalism. I would say it's that it was a broken promise, but also the promise itself was flawed, or the ideal underlying the promise was flawed. It wasn't redeemed, and it was flawed in ways that help us understand why it couldn't have been redeemed. To be concrete, I like the way you describe it as the embrace of market-driven globalization by center-left parties. You summarize that as efficiency now, equity later. And to make it concrete, we had in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who made an explicit argument that government is the problem, markets are the solution. Government impinges on freedom, markets enable us to realize freedom. And they embraced the market through that explicit ideological claim. when they faded from the political scene, when they were displaced by center-left parties and politicians, Bill Clinton in the United States, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany. These political figures and parties did not challenge the fundamental market premise of the neoliberal globalization project. To the contrary, they continued it. What they did was they moderated, they softened its harsh edges. They offered to shore up the safety net, but they didn't challenge the fundamental premise that market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. They softened and humanized the harsh edges of laissez-faire market capitalism as an approach to globalization. They continued it, though, including deregulating the financial industry. In the name, just as you suggest, Christopher, of saying, we will have efficiency now, or we will increase the size of the pie now, and the gains to the gainers can be used to offset the loss to the losers. That was the promise, and that was the broken promise to which you refer. And I would say about that promise two things. First, it never really, the redistribution never really happened in ways you've described, but in part it didn't happen because by embracing the political economy of a kind of market-driven globalization and deregulation, especially of finance, they created conditions, these parties did, and the center-left parties did, together with the center-right parties. They created conditions that contributed to the oligarchic capture of representative democracy and the regulatory bodies that would have been the instruments for the redistribution that had been promised. So that by 2008, Barack Obama becomes the first Democratic candidate for president to raise more money during his campaign from Wall Street than his Republican opponent. So you see this shift happening. And by 2016, the Democratic Party has become the party more attuned to the interests and the outlook of the professional classes, the credentialed classes, university educated, meritocratic classes, than the working class voters who once constituted the base and the reason for being of the Democratic Party. And so 2/3 of white non-college educated voters in 2016 vote for Donald Trump. And in part because the Democratic Party has become essentially the party of the professional, educated, successful classes. And in her campaign, Hillary Clinton egregiously kind of announced and proclaimed this and boasted about it even. And what's striking is that this isn't happening only in the United States. Same thing happened to the Labour Party in Britain, who lost working class voters to UKIP and then in the Brexit vote. The educational divide was as stark in the Brexit vote as it was in the Trump-Hillary Clinton election. Yeah. Same thing happened to the Socialist Party in France. And you've written very interestingly about France and Macron, and he is the embodiment of this meritocratic kind of Claire Clinton tradition. So same thing happened in France. And so what happens is parties that traditionally concede their mission and purpose as defending working people against powerful interests, big corporations, and elites now have lost their connection to working class constituencies, having embraced meritocratic, highly educated professional elites. So that, I think, also explains why the promise, such as it was not vindicated. But I also think, going to the philosophical aspects of this, that the ideal was flawed. The idea, insofar as these center-left parties making their peace with market-driven globalization, financialization of the economy as well, which is as important as the globalization of it.
Yes.
They were essentially drawing on, I think, a flawed ideal, which goes to the disagreements I've had with Rawlsian liberalism, that it's overly individualistic. And although it presents itself as a theory that can support an egalitarian, a welfare state with egalitarian aspirations, it rests on a conception of the person or of the self that is too atomized and individualistic to morally underwrite the ethic of sharing and community and solidarity that the welfare state, a more robust welfare state, would have required. So that's why I say the promise, sorry for the long answer, Christopher, but the promise was broken and the promise was flawed. It rested on a flawed ideal, I would say.
Yes, there is a paradox here, a philosophical paradox that reminds me actually a bit of Delbo Winthrop's work, which is something that that's a body of work that is familiar to you and or to many of you. And I was wondering if I might talk about it in that light. She had an idea, drawing on Aristotle, that correct me if I'm describing this view wrong, but that our idea of society as a whole relies on our heterogeneity, and that for people to need each other in a society, they must be actually filling lacks that other people have. And so that in that sense, society begins, if you can use this as a metaphor, you can use this literally, society begins kind of gendered. There are people who are compensating other people for absences they have in their individual lives. And if we set up this project of bringing everyone to the starting line in absolutely identical shape, we actually wind up eliminating the grounds for us to care about one another. And so there's a tension, isn't there, between this striving for individual excellence and the articulation of the individuals into a social whole.
Well, I would put it slightly differently, but there's a connection here, I think, or you'll tell me whether there's a connection.
Yeah.
I would say, in the view that I develop all the way back, beginning with Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, which was the critique of Rawls, up through the Tyranny of Merit, I think that, well, I wouldn't say, I like the way you put it, that we need one another to fill unanswered or incompleteness. Maybe that's a better way, to fill incompleteness in ourselves, that we are not by ourselves self-sufficient beings. And the way I would put that, Christopher, would be to say that we need a form of social and political life that is differentiated. I would say differentiated rather than gendered, because I think there are multiple dimensions of differentiation that matter and that need to be incorporated into social and political life. So differentiation, I would put it this way, is a necessary aspect of a good society and economy. And it's necessary for two reasons, I would say. One, I mean, why do we need differentiation? Why is it necessary to remind ourselves that we are not self-sufficient beings? One reason, and I think both can be found in Aristotle, is that it's necessary to prompt learning, that we be differentiated. We learn from the differentiated roles and capacities and excellences and strengths of our fellow citizens. Even the dissonance created by noticing these differences is a prompt, a spur to learning, and the kind of learning, moral and civic learning, that enriches us and is part of a good life. The second way in which differentiation is a necessary condition of a good society, and this has especially to do with the configuration of the economy, is that it provides an occasion for each of us to figure out how to meet the needs of others, and if we do so in some measure, to win honor or recognition or esteem for having done so. So the first need is to do with learning, and the second need is to do with contributing and winning recognition. So on this picture, and it's the picture of an economy that I emphasize in the book, an economy is not only, as Smith and Keynes thought, for the sake of consumption, of consuming. It's also for the sake of, I would say, contributing to meeting the needs of others and winning recognition, honor, esteem for doing so. And to connect this to our earlier discussion of contemporary politics, I think part of what animates the anger and resentment of working people who've been left behind by globalization and the meritocratic attitudes towards success that have accompanied it is that they believe that the work they do is no longer honored or respected in the way it once was. So being looked down upon, it's not only that they have less money or less financial success or a less lustrous education. It's the deepest, the most galling aspect is the sense that what I have to contribute isn't needed or valued or honored. This also has a certain connection, and Sarah knows a lot about this and has thought some about this, with Catholic social teaching, according to which the fundamental human need is the need to be needed by others and to be able to contribute to meeting those needs and to be recognized for doing so. So this idea of an economy of recognition, of contribution and recognition, I think is what we're lacking. And when I argue in the book for renewing the dignity of work, shifting our political discourse to emphasize the dignity of work, it's ultimately to honor this aspect of our need for an economy of recognition, of mutual recognition, to overcome the sense that people have, great many people have, that their contributions aren't needed or don't matter.
Might I ask you?
Let me step in. Can I step in now? And I would like to ask a quick question.
Oh yeah.
And then we can, I think, go to questions from our audience. So, Michael, our politics seems to be today about economic issues and cultural issues. And I wonder whether your discussion doesn't slight the latter. Maybe you were edging over in that direction just now to speak of mutual recognition. But the liberals and conservatives that we have today in our parties oppose each other in both economics and in culture. And Yuval Levin had it rather nicely when he said that conservatives are winning the economic issue, but losing the cultural issue. And unfortunately, they think more, or they're more attached to the cultural issue. Whereas liberals are winning the cultural issue, but losing the economic issue. So unfortunately, they care more about the economic issue. So each side is winning where it doesn't care and losing where it most cares. So what about the cultural issue? What about let's just concentrate on the family, the American family, and the disintegration of the American family, and the changes in our thinking which have contributed to this, especially those changes which set a high value on autonomy. It doesn't seem that autonomy is a value that's easily compatible with community or the common good. So what about the desire for autonomy as an enemy of the common good, not just economic merit?
Yeah, well, to start with autonomy, I've, as you know, long been a critic of moral and political philosophy that defines freedom only or primarily in terms of autonomy, where autonomy is understood as freedom of choice, this freedom of the freedom to choose my ends unconstrained or uninhibited by others or other considerations or traditions or antecedent moral claims. So I've generally been critical of a version of liberalism and of conservatism that depend, insofar as they depend, on making autonomy the central value. But I want also to say something about the terms of relation between the economy and the culture. Part of my argument, and one of my reasons for emphasizing the dignity of work, is to challenge the distinction, the sharp distinction we often make between the economy and the culture, or between economic issues and cultural issues. If I'm right about the erosion of the dignity of work contributing to the resentments that animate the embrace of figures like Trump, then it would be a mistake to distinguish too sharply between the economy and the culture. It would be important to recognize that work and the status of work and the character of work and the rewards conferred on work of various kinds, these are economic and cultural issues, both at the same time. Recognition, insofar as work is part of a scheme of the dignity of work, is part of an economy of recognition. That's a cultural matter. It's about meaning, not just an economic matter, understood as being about consumption or purchasing power. So part of what I'm proposing, part of what I'm suggesting that those on the left and on the right should do to morally invigorate our public discourse is to recognize the sense in which the shape of the economy and the attitudes that it fosters are continuous with cultural questions and questions of meaning and value and purpose. But part of what animates, part of the appeal exerted by the meritocratic idea of rising, the rhetoric of rising that has so figured in our politics and that I document in the book, there is an ideal of autonomy embedded in that. It's the idea that if only chances were equal, then, and if only the market were free, then the rewards conferred by the market would be morally deserved. Not only that, they would reflect positions and success would reflect the autonomy of each person deciding how hard to work, for example. And so I do think a certain flawed conception of freedom is part of what animates the meritocratic ideal of securing individual upward mobility through higher education as the response to the problems we face, the erosion of the common good. I say that's a mistake.
Okay.
Could I just ask you one thing about you know, you throughout you have a sort of a two-track anticipation of what people will find lacking in meritocracy. One is a failure. The people will critique a failure to live up to meritocracy,
Right.
and on the other hand, people will dispute that it is a meritocracy at all.
Yeah.
I would say that in the and I'm just talking off the top of my head here, I would say that in the populist critiques that have emerged in the last couple of years, it's the latter critique that really dominates, the idea that this isn't a real meritocracy. And I think that if you ask, I assume, the man on the street what he thinks is the greatest offense against meritocracy in our society, he will name affirmative action. And I was struck that although you alluded to affirmative action in a number of times there, it was mostly just to sort of like in a kind of on the one hand, on the other hand way. You noted that some people found it an affront to meritocracy. Other people, like Chris Hayes, notably, find it a tool of meritocracy. But these are two things that I was surprised to see missing from your book. The first is affirmative action. The second is the possibility of a mandarinate, that route to purifying the meritocracy, the idea of, say, neutral civil service tests of the sort that exist in the sort of Confucian tradition in Asia and have been picked up to a degree in the French system of higher education. Why is that not a possibility for at least, if not solving all the problems of meritocracy, at least making it a little bit more of an equitable meritocracy?
It's essentially a technocratic conception of merit, the idea of the neutral civil servant tests. And I think that the idea that a neutral, fair-minded civil service technocracy could govern well is continuous, Christopher. I would say it's continuous with the meritocratic conception that predominates. Now, the problem is, well, let me back up. If we could identify those best at governing, then we would want them to have a greater say and influence in the conduct of public life. To that extent, I agree with Aristotle. But for Aristotle, the ability to rule well requires more than being a good civil servant or a good technocrat. It requires phronesis, practical judgment, which is a moral as well as an intellectual virtue. And it requires the ability to identify with people from all walks of life and to be good at deliberating about the common good. So it's a moral and set of moral and civic virtues, not technocratic ones. And one way of describing what's gone wrong with our conception of meritocracy is that we've conceived excellence at governing well in largely technocratic terms. And I attribute this in large part to the rising influence of a certain branch of economics in universities, but also in governing. The credulity that politicians have for economists and their credentials and economistic arguments that present themselves as value neutral I think this has been one source of the folly of the meritocratic mode of governance that has accompanied the version, the globalizing project of the last 4 decades. So part of what I would do would be to challenge the technocratic notion of excellence in governance by suggesting that it lacks, besides and in its own self-definition as being value neutral, it lacks any conception of moral and civic virtue or any conception of the common good apart from an economistic one. And I think part of the resentment against experts that we see, including during the pandemic, reflects the discrediting and really the failure of technocratic, which is to say economistic, governance over the last 4 decades. Would you disagree with that, Christopher?
Chris, a quick answer, and then we have questions from Mark Landy and Andy Zwick.
Okay, but what do you think?
I wouldn't necessarily disagree, and I wasn't asking the question to sort of like to arrive at a better way of governing, more at a way of reassuring the public as to the integrity of the principles on which elites were chosen. But maybe that'll come up in the next questions.
Mark, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. And Michael, I'm really very sympathetic to a notion of dignifying work, of finding more capacious understandings of merit. But I just want to preface my question by quoting a conversation that happened many decades ago with someone that so many of you and myself revere, Samuel Beer. Sam said to me, Harvard was boring until after the war when we let the Jews in. Okay. No, he's not.
Was born, I'm sorry, Mark, he said what? Harvard was
boring.
boring, I see.
He's been there for almost 2 decades already.
Yeah.
It was boring until we let the Jews in. That's not affirmative action, right? That's a bow toward merit. Now, of course, in the contemporary world, it's more merit benefits Asians. And so, in a way, what I want to press you on is how do you improve on the overly technocratic understanding of meritocracy without opening up all the things that Sam would say made Harvard boring in the old days, too many children of the privileged would probably, above all, what he would point to. So I really appreciate your argument, but help me with practicalities. What do we do that doesn't open up other forms of terrible ways of measuring merit?
Well, I certainly think Sam was right that Harvard, in the days when most of the students came from privileged families and private boarding schools in the Northeast, that first of all, that was not a meritocracy.
No.
And it's certainly not the alternative to meritocracy that I favor, going back to the days of that kind of privilege and essentially inherited claim to rule or to be admitted to elite institutions. In many ways, the selective colleges and universities in the United States have become vastly more diverse, and I think for the better, than in those old days of aristocratic privilege. There is one respect in which they haven't. I mean, if you look at the percentage of first-generation college students at Harvard today, it's about 16 or 17%, which is about the same percentage it was in the early 1960s. That's a long time ago. So and this reflects the way in which, even with more meritocratic admissions, well-off parents have figured out how to give an edge to their children, such that there is a very close correlation between SAT scores and family income. And yet the SAT was meant to be, and to some extent was, an instrument of the new meritocratic way of admitting students. I do have in the book what some may regard as a scandalous proposal, though it's a modest proposal and it doesn't solve this problem in a general way. Let me say first, I think that selective colleges and universities should make a greater effort to admit first-generation students and students from poor backgrounds. There, even with generous financial aid policies, there are more students in Ivy League universities from the top 1% than from the bottom half of the country. And so I think we should look at the class profile and the first generation profile and try to do better. I mean, I do have another proposal, but I'll maybe save that for later because I know that people have questions.
Andy.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this, Michael, and to Chris and Sarah for your contributions and questions. As an undergrad, I took your course, Justice, Michael, and recall well much dialogue about markets and morals. This was the late 90s, and probably more discussion of Nike sneakers and so on, predates social media, of course. And I'm sympathetic to your assessment of credentialism and want to ask you more about how we look at big challenges we face. I mean, pressing things like the development and distribution of vaccines of such great import to all of us today. And you speak about the recognition and honor of accomplishing things in the market and in society. So in the case of something tangible like this, some succeed. Pfizer and BioNTech, Moderna, some fail. I could be getting this wrong, but I think Sanofi is one of the companies that had high hopes of success. Yeah. And as I understand it, a company like that is now taking on the responsibility for manufacture of these mRNA vaccines. So don't we need certain aspects of merit to just encourage us to be grown-ups and promote excellence and outcomes? So I guess my question is really more of the compared to what variety? I mean, how do we get the various benefits, you know, in dealing with the big problems and challenges, some of which, because I mentioned the distribution aspect, all kinds of Americans and workers from around the world can play a very important role in dealing with a big challenge like this. And this feels to me very different from talking about Nike sneakers or social media.
Right. So how to address the question of vaccine development and distribution from the standpoint of meritocracy. I don't know that meritocracy has a lot to do with this question, but I suspect maybe the connection, Andy, that you have in mind may be that there were enormous incentives provided for vaccine companies to speedily and successfully come up with COVID vaccines. And perhaps you're thinking that the connection between the need for these incentives provides a case for meritocracy generally. And if that's the connection, I have views about pharmaceutical industry. and what sorts of incentives we should use and do use to encourage research and development of needed drugs and therapeutics. Part of the issue that's going to loom large soon, Andy, about the vaccines is whether there's a moral obligation of rich countries to share the vaccines with poor countries. Countries representing 16% of the world's population have so far bought up 60% of the vaccines.
I think you're right about my question about merit, which is
Yeah,
the subject of merit to something that is most needed. I mean, some
right,
create the vaccines and some people were going to succeed and some people weren't. And there's
right,
how do we, handle the question of dignity of work at different levels, whether it is
right,
the person driving the UPS truck or somebody who's deputized to
right,
do injections around the country and around the world. I mean, before
right,
we get to the question of how to divide them. So anyway, that's what I meant in terms of.
right. Well, I'll try to give a quick answer. So, all right, I'm on the right track of understanding the impulse behind the thought behind the question. I think there are many ways of creating incentives for pharmaceutical companies to engage in research and development that the common good requires. One way, which is our way, is to provide a very big payoff in the terms of highly protected intellectual property rights, a kind of sweepstakes. Another way, but that has various drawbacks. And one of the drawbacks we're up against and will be soon is we could massively increase availability of these successful vaccines if we suspended or bought out intellectual property rights and allowed generic manufacturers in India and Brazil and various other places to ramp up production. And I think we should do that. Now, we can argue about what form of compensation, or buyout should be in exchange for suspending intellectual property rights. But so there are other models for providing incentives for drug development that don't depend on sweepstakes like intellectual property rights that confer monopolies and reduce production, especially during a pandemic. And there could be various forms of public payout for drugs that don't require these strict intellectual property rights that reduce the ability to generate enough drugs. So in the short term, I would say, suspend intellectual property rights on these successful vaccines, let the generic manufacturing take place, vastly ramp up production to bring the pandemic to an end, and then we can debate what forms of compensation there should be for doing that.
Thank you.
We have questions from Avi Nelson and Jack Swanson, please.
Well, what you just said invites another question. The sweepstakes you talk about would then not be the marketplace, but would be determined by some small political agency or small political committee, or worse, an individual who would determine who shall be funded to do research in the vaccine, what vaccine would be determined. I'm very skeptical that central government authority would do a better job at creating vaccines than the marketplace. We do not have perfect systems. We are not perfect beings. But to centralize authority, I contend it would make it worse. And incidentally, I'll connect that. You seem to suggest that the Trump supporters are somehow upset because their work is being devalued. I would contend more of the factor there is the centralization of the power, which you just recommended expanding. But if you'll allow, I have a more fundamental question. You seem to say that people are somehow psychologically depressed or their egos shriveled because they think their work is somehow unvalued or devalued in the world as a whole. We all very quickly learn that we can't hit a baseball like Ted Williams, compose music like Beethoven, or do physics like Einstein. In fact, very few of us can attain the rank of a professorship at Harvard. I don't know of people who spend their lives being morose because their contributions or their efforts or their abilities somehow fall short of some of the distinguished members of this panel or members of this audience. And I really don't think that people somehow resent that merit will indeed allow others to rise higher, whatever that means, in terms of the economic sphere, and maybe even in terms of prestige. We accord prestige, for example, to actors and to professional athletes. I don't know that they're necessarily somehow better human beings. I hear frequently how people say, oh, we should pay teachers more. We should elevate the rank of nobility of teaching far above, say, professional athleticism. But the reality is that very few people line up to get a teacher's autograph when a whole bunch of people line up to get Tom Brady's autograph. This is a way, in a way, it's a supply and demand function. And meritocracy strikes me as a pretty good way of doing it. Does it have its imperfections? Yes, but I don't think that the rest of the world who didn't achieve, some higher economic or prestige status is spending their lives in sort of psychological decay, lamenting their low status in life.
Okay, well, I know, I can tell from your comments that you like the free market and the freedom associated with the free market. I'm not sure that conception of the free market aligns exactly with meritocracy. So I think what you want is you want a defense of the free market. I'm not sure that's the same as a defense of meritocracy. And as for the vaccines, the idea that governments should decide what vaccines will be funded and invested in and bought. That's the system we have now, not the system that, and that's exactly how these vaccines were funded. And some of them were funded privately, some were funded with government funds, but the decisions on which vaccines would be bought, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, these are all contracts with central governments. So insofar as we have a free market with supply and demand for these vaccines, it's a free market consisting of a handful of big buyers, governments, or in the case of the European Union, the entire EU. Now, there may be problems with that, but I think it would be a little bit silly to assume that the existing market for COVID vaccines is anything other than central governments deciding where to place their bets and where to make, with what drug companies to make contracts for promising vaccines.
I think that's a fair comment, but I thought that you were moving toward even greater centralized authority in terms of the distribution and, sort of determining winners and losers altogether by the central authority.
So you would, but we had them determining winners and losers just now. Do you think it would have been better to have, individual? Maybe you do think it would have been better to have a free market in vaccine purchase and distribution. We certainly don't have that now. And are you quarreling with this system? If not, you're accepting as centralized a buying. Centralized a market is imaginable. The only question I was raising was whether the incentive takes the form of intellectual property rights, or that prevent generics from being generated, or whether we should provide incentives and rewards in some other way.
Sorry, Avi, we need to move on. Jack's.
Thank you, Professor Sandel, for this discussion and for taking questions. My question is pretty straightforward. Having finished your book, I was sort of left wondering, how do we actually ensure that there is a dignity of work? And I think it's an all the more compelling question just because it seems as if for a while, people didn't have to ask the question since things were so localized and since people felt they contributed to the community. But obviously now in a global world, it's much easier to feel like you're not contributing to your community. So do you have any sort of like concrete ideas on how that would work within the community? And do you think that perhaps there's something inherent about globalization that makes it difficult to feel like you're contributing to anything?
Well, I think Jack raises a very important point. It's a really important question, whether the sense of feeling that of being able to contribute to the common good and to feel that those contributions are being honored and recognized, does that presuppose bounded communities or bounded economies to some degree, in a way that is made more difficult in a world where goods, capital, and people flow across national boundaries, especially goods and capital in the case of the global economy? I think that's a fascinating question. I think for there to be a scheme of contribution and recognition, I think there have to be a certain bounded community. There have to be forms of political and economic association where people feel that they are engaged in a common project. Because how else would it be possible to reason together and argue together about what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good? The dignity of work, renewing the dignity of work, I think does, well, put it this way, renewing the dignity of work is bound up, Jack, I would say, with figuring out how to rebuild communities with which people identify. Because it's only within such communities that we can have meaningful discussions about what contributions really do contribute to the purposes and ends that this community cares about. This goes back in a way to the question Christopher was raising about Hayek and Rawls. One of the reasons both would agree it's a mistake to assume that, let's take a concrete example, that a very successful sports star, LeBron James, morally deserves the benefits the market bestows on his great basketball talent. His having that talent is not all his doing, however much he may train and cultivate his talents. But more than that, the fact that he lives in a society that prizes and loves basketball, that's not his doing, that's his good luck. Had he lived back in the days of the Renaissance, they cared more about fresco painters than basketball players then. So both Hayek and Rawls recognize that recognize the contingency and the luck that goes into market definitions of what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. And so it's a mistake to assume that however hard we try and work and cultivate our talents, that we are self-made and self-sufficient, and that our success is our due. I think both Hayek and Rawls were right about that. And so that takes us back to the idea that we have to determine, as a moral and political question, what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. And there can be no such deliberation without there being determinate, somewhat bounded communities of membership and meaning. And the dignity of work, if it's true that the dignity of work depends on this element of contribution and recognition, then, Jack, I would say that a perfectly porous, frictionless, universal notion of the economy would make that project, the affirmation of the dignity of work, difficult, if not impossible. What do you think? Or I should ask, I mean, there may be others. Christopher may have thoughts about that. What do you think, Christopher? Jack has asked a good question. What do you think?
Yes, I do. Well, I have a question that goes for you that goes in a slightly different direction of that same thing. And perhaps in your answering it, you will, in asking it, I will sort of like answer Jack's in a way. I was struck when you get down to brass tacks, I was given a troubling impression by your book, which I think is probably not the impression you meant to leave, but maybe you're aware of it. Meritocracy, particularly as you give it a historical background in I think it's the second to last chapter of your book, when you're talking about John Gardner and the Great Society, when you're talking about Conant, when you say that the goal is not excellence so much as social mobility, right? I wonder about the price we pay for social mobility. And so when we look at when you look at students applying for college, that is obviously a spectacular example of where they're paying a kind of tax in terms of their life, in the currency of their life, of their education, of their development. They're paying a tax for the privilege of social mobility. That is, instead of learning real stuff, instead of going out and playing, instead of having conversations, instead of nurturing their ties with their family, they're going out and getting tutored on a series of tricks to pass the SAT. Okay, that is a kind of a stylized example of this problem, but it exists everywhere. It's not just students applying to college. It's also, professionals of all kinds, including in faculties, who are trying to sort of like rig rules to keep competitors out of their, fields and things like that. And you get the impression that we're spending a non-trivial amount of our time just battling over social hierarchies in a way that people in an outright class system do not. I mean, so at a certain point, you sort of start to say, is this cost worth it? Is social mobility worth it? Has that question in its bluntest form occurred to you in the course of writing this book?
Well, you're right that I do emphasize the moral and civic costs to a single-minded focus on social mobility, also the educational costs. Yes. Now, that does not make me nostalgic for an aristocratic class system, or going back to Mark Landy's question, to Sam Beers saying, how boring it was when everyone at Harvard came from boarding schools and privileged families. Doesn't make me nostalgic for that. But yes, I do emphasize the moral and civic and educational costs we pay for a single-minded preoccupation with social mobility, which does not mean that we should abandon equality of opportunity. It does mean, I think, that we should regard equal opportunity, true equality of opportunity, which is a moral imperative. We should still regard it as a remedial virtue, not, if we could achieve it, as the definition of a just society or of a good society. It's not a self-sufficient moral ideal. So yes, I do emphasize, I don't think we're disagreeing on this, Christopher, that there are moral and civic and educational costs to our single-minded preoccupation with social mobility. More than that, I would say it's been a mistake politically to respond to the deepening inequalities of recent decades, not by dealing with those inequalities themselves, but by offering individual upward mobility through higher education. That's another way of describing the broken promise we were discussing of progressive politics. They failed, the figures we were discussing, to address inequality as such, and instead were offering mobility, upward mobility through individual upward mobility through higher education. And that project in the end proved corrosive of the common good. That's another way of describing the failure. Now, that raises the question, well, all right, what should they be offering instead? And I don't say instead they should be offering, getting back to the class society, to class rigidity, aristocracy, but it does suggest that we need a politics of the common good that addresses inequalities from a civic point of view, that addresses the dignity of work from a moral point of view, that and that does not focus only or primarily on telling people, if only you get into a good college, then you can rise, even as the rungs on the ladder are growing further and further apart, you too will be able to clamber up the ladder of success. That, I think, has been the mistake.
Unfortunately, we're over time. Sarah, I'm going to give you the last question.
Yeah.
Paul, I'm sorry. I saw you. You were trying to ask a question, but yes.
Okay, well, it better be a good question then. As I'm thinking more about this language of the dignity of work, which I think is very attractive on so many levels, I wonder if it runs up against a limit or a boundary. I recall Bloomberg, either this was immediately before or immediately after the election, had a chart displaying the percentages of different groups, self-identified different groups, who donated to Trump versus to Biden. And of course, you have many members of the technocratic elite, lawyers, social workers, teachers, in the blue section of this chart. And two groups that gave overwhelmingly to Donald Trump were self-identified stay-at-home moms and homemakers. And those who identified as a wife were 5 times more likely to donate to Donald Trump as opposed to Joe Biden. And as I was thinking about this, I know there's been a push recently from a number of very, very prominent women for a Marshall Plan for moms, insisting that motherhood is a job, that it ought to be paid. And there's been some pushback against this, saying that this is not a job. It involves work, but it's fundamentally different. And so I wonder what you make of that, and if there's not perhaps an argument for speaking of vocation instead of work, if perhaps we are reticent to make something like motherhood or something like parenthood into any other kind of traditional job. And there's a lot of debate going on in Washington, I know right now, among certain corners about family policy. And so thinking about what the right locus of community is, what should be designated a job versus perhaps a vocation. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. Yeah, it is a terrific question. And the dignity of work is too narrow. I think you're right, Sarah. And it's narrow, especially insofar as we assimilate work to contributions that are compensated through the labor market, work that's commodified in effect. And so what your question, and really the insight underlying the question, suggest is that the dignity of work is partial, and what it gestures toward is something broader, which is the dignity, honor, and esteem that should ideally be conferred on contributions to the common good generally, whether or not they are mediated by the labor market or commodified. And this, I think, is the broader project in moral and civic terms, which goes to, I suppose, what might be called a moral economy, a moral and political economy of contribution, whose, and the form that the recognition and the honor take, the form that these forms of recognition take may partly be economic and partly cultural. This touches also on Harvey's earlier question about the economy and the culture. This is why it seems to me we make a mistake to separate too starkly the economy and the culture. Because insofar as the dignity of work is too narrow for just the reasons that you've described, Sarah, what we should really be after is a moral and political economy of contribution. And to achieve that requires a politics of the common good that goes beyond encouraging or focusing unduly on individual upward mobility as a solution to inequality, and focusing more broadly on according honor, recognition, esteem, and support for contributions to the common good, whether they happen in the workplace or in the raising of families or in the building of communities. But figuring this out isn't easy because it requires a morally more robust kind of public discourse than the kind to which we're accustomed. One that engages with contested conceptions of the common good and what counts as a truly valuable contribution to the common good. But I think that this is an argument in its favor, not an argument against it. I think we've been talking about the anger and frustration with our existing economic and political arrangements. I think one of the most pervasive sources of frustration is with the empty terms of public discourse. And I think technocracy has partly to do with this. So does our inability to listen to one another and to engage with the moral convictions that citizens bring to public life. So a moral and political economy of contribution, beyond even the dignity of work, I think, would require this kind of morally robust public discourse. What shape it would take and what solutions it might offer are questions perhaps for our next seminar. But Sarah, thank you. And Christopher, Harvey, thank you so much for convening us. And thank you for those questions.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's 2 p.m. or past 2 p.m. and we have to stop. But I think this debate has been a contribution to the common good, and it illustrates the dignity of work. So our thanks to Sarah Gustafson and Chris Caldwell and Michael Sandel, a professor in the best sense of the term.
Thank you.